Ukraine came a step closer on Tuesday to winning the fleet of modern battle tanks it hopes could turn the course of the war against Russia, after the West's big holdout Germany said this would be the first item on its new defense minister's agenda. In the central city of Dnipro, more bodies were pulled from the rubble of an apartment block on Tuesday, raising the death toll to 44 in the deadliest attack for civilians of a 3-month Russian missile bombardment campaign. Dozens more people were still missing. Local officials said 79 people were wounded and 39 rescued from the rubble. Nearly 11 months after Russia invaded, Kyiv says a fleet of Western battle tanks would give its forces the mobile firepower they need to drive Russian troops out in decisive battles in 2023. German-made Leopard battle tanks, the workhorse of armies across Europe, are widely seen as the only plausible choice to supply Ukraine with the large-scale tank force it needs. But they cannot be delivered without authorization from Berlin, which has so far stalled. With Western allies meeting at a U.S. airbase in Germany on Friday to pledge military support for Ukraine, Berlin is under intense pressure to lift its objections this week, in what would be one of the most consequential shifts in Western aid so far. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions driven from their homes since Russia launched what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine in February last year. Ukrainian forces drove Russian troops back during the second half of 2022, but over the past 2 months the front lines have largely been frozen in place despite both sides enduring heavy losses in relentless fighting. Ukrainian officials say tanks would be key to breaking the stalemate. Russia claims to have captured the small mining town of Soledar on the outskirts of the eastern city of Bakhmut last week. Kyiv has said it is still fighting there. Moscow, meanwhile, has turned since October to a tactic of raining missiles down on Ukrainian cities far from the front, mainly targeting electricity infrastructure. Russia says it aims to reduce Ukraine's ability to fight. Kyiv says the attacks serve no military purpose and are intended to harm civilians, a war crime. In Dnipro, residents left flowers and cuddly toys at a makeshift memorial near the apartment block destroyed during Russia's wave of missile attacks on Saturday. Russia attacked Ukraine in February last year, saying Kyiv's close ties with the West created a security threat. Ukraine and its Western allies call it an unprovoked war to seize land and impose Russia's will on its neighbor. The death toll from a weekend Russian missile strike on an apartment building in the southeastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro has risen to 40, authorities said Monday, as Western analysts pointed to indications the Kremlin was preparing for a drawn-out war in Ukraine after almost 11 months of fighting. About 1,700 people lived in the multi-story building, and search and rescue crews have worked non-stop since Saturday's strike to locate victims and survivors in the wreckage. The regional administration said 39 people have been rescued so far and 30 more remained missing. Authorities said at least 75 were wounded. The reported death toll made it the deadliest single attack on Ukrainian civilians since before the summer, according to the Associated Press Frontline War Crimes Watch project. Residents said the apartment tower did not house any military facilities. Asked about the strike Monday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the Russian military doesn't target residential buildings and suggested the Dnipro building was hit as a result of Ukrainian air defense actions. The strike on the building came amid a wider barrage of Russian cruise missiles across Ukraine. The Ukrainian military said Sunday that it did not have the means to intercept the type of Russian missile that hit the residential building in Dnipro. Fierce fighting continued to rage Monday in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk province, where military analysts have said both sides are likely suffering heavy troop casualties. No independent verification of developments was possible. Donetsk and neighboring Luhansk province make up the Donbass, an expansive industrial region bordering Russia that Russian President Vladimir Putin identified as a focus from the war's outset. Moscow-backed separatists have been fighting Kyiv's forces there since 2014. The Russian and Belarusian air forces began a joint exercise Monday in Belarus, which borders Ukraine and served as a staging ground for Russia's February 24 invasion of Ukraine. The drills are set to run through February 1, the Belarusian Defense Ministry said. Russia has sent its warplanes to Belarus for the drills. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington think tank, reported signs of the Kremlin taking steps to turn its Ukraine invasion into a major conventional war after months of embarrassing military reversals. What Moscow calls a special military operation aimed to capture the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, within weeks and to install a Kremlin-friendly regime there, but Russian forces ultimately withdrew from around Kyiv, the think tank said. Then came a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in recent months before the onset of winter slowed military advances. NATO member nations have sought in recent days to reassure Ukraine that they will stay the course. The United Kingdom has pledged tanks, and the U.S. military's new, expanded combat training of Ukrainian forces began in Germany on Sunday. Russian forces shelled the city of Kherson and the Kherson region, killing 3 people and wounding 14 others over the last 24 hours, Regional Governor Yaroslav Yanushevich said. In the city of Kherson, the shelling damaged a hospital, a children's disability center, a shipyard, critical infrastructure, and apartment buildings. Russian forces struck the city of Zaporizhia, damaging industrial infrastructure and wounding 5 people, 2 of them children. Russian air defenses downed 7 drones Monday over the Black Sea near the port of Sevastopol in annexed Crimea, Mikhail Razvozayev. The devastation caused by a Russian airstrike on an apartment building in Dnipro, Ukraine, on Saturday. Russia's destruction of an apartment building in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro has sparked widespread condemnation of Vladimir Putin. The devastating missile strike on the block of flats on Saturday in the east of the country has claimed the lives of at least 35 people, while another 35 people are still missing. Up to 75 survivors were injured by the strike. Dozens of people are feared dead, trapped under the rubble. Former boxer Vladimir Klitschko, who joined the Ukrainian armed forces after Russia's invasion began last February and whose brother is mayor of Kyiv, tweeted an image of the aftermath of the devastating missile strike on Dnipro. While Russia has denied targeting civilians, some have pointed to the attack as being a clear indication of how Putin plans to wage his war. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, tweeted a video of the destroyed apartment building and wrote, "Putin was here." Russia's initial invasion plan was to take over the country in a matter of weeks, if not days. However, Putin has recently acknowledged that he is preparing his military for the long haul. In December he warned the Russian population that they should be prepared for the special military operation, as he prefers to call the war, to be a long process. Some commentators are increasingly convinced Putin plans to copy the military playbook he used so effectively in Aleppo, Syria. This saw a years-long, indiscriminate bombing campaign that destroyed hospitals and schools and killed and maimed thousands upon thousands of civilians. The next step in Ukraine could see a major new offensive launched by Putin in the spring, meaning Kyiv is locked in a race to build up its troops with support from the West. On Saturday, Rishi Sunak confirmed the UK will provide tanks to Ukraine to help it push Russian troops back. Sunak made the pledge during a call with President Volodymyr Zelensky prior to Russia's missile strike on Dnipro. Dnipro, Ukraine, January 15, 2023, rescuers dismantled the rubble of a destroyed house that was damaged as a result of a missile attack by the Russian army. On January 14, the Russian army launched massive missile strikes on Ukraine. As a result of the shelling of the city of Dnipro, a rocket hit an apartment building. As of January 15, 30 people died, including 1 child, 73 people were injured, including 13 children. 43 people are missing. At least 35 people were killed in a Russian strike on an apartment building in Dnipro, Ukraine. The death toll from a Russian missile strike in eastern Ukraine rose to 30, more than 30 are missing, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday. Tributes left at the site of an apartment building in Dnipro, Ukraine, that was targeted in a Russian missile strike. The UK is the first Western power to supply the Ukrainians with main battle tanks. It comes after the US promised 50 Bradley tank-killing armored vehicles in its biggest military assistance package to date for Ukraine. Germany also announced it would supply about 40 Marder armored personnel carriers, and France promised wheeled AMX-10 RC tank destroyers. Russia is suffering from profound problems with its dysfunctional long-range missiles, Britain's Ministry of Defense has said. Officials said there is evidence from Ukraine that the Kremlin's missile systems are highly likely struggles to identify targets. The update comes after a Russian missile hit an apartment building in Dnipro, killing at least 40 people and injuring multiple others. Earlier, Russia sanctioned British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly in a punitive move over the Ukraine war and asked the top official about why he has supported neo-Nazism and the Kyiv administration run by Volodymyr Zelensky. The British official, who will hold diplomatic talks with his US and Canadian counterparts starting today to rally more support for Ukraine, confirmed that he has been targeted by Moscow, and added that if that were the price to be paid for supporting the war-hit nation, then he was happy to be sanctioned. Russia is suffering from profound problems with its dysfunctional long-range missiles, Britain's Ministry of Defense has said. Officials said there is evidence from Ukraine that the Kremlin's missile systems are highly likely struggles to identify targets. Saturday's attack on Dnipro's building has claimed 40 civilian lives despite Russia's claims that its attack on Ukraine did not target civilians. The victims included 3 children, officials said. Volodymyr Zelensky has thanked the British administration for helping Ukraine by sending military aid, latest in the slew of ammunition and military vehicles being poured into the war-hit country by the West. Just 24 hours earlier, an explosion in Belgorod claimed 3 lives and wounded 16 others, officials said after an ammunition detonated at a Russian base at the Tonenkoy farm, in the Korochanski district. Another 8 people have been reported missing. The UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has totaled the civilian casualties in the Ukraine war to more than 18,000 since the first day of Russian invasion in its latest update. As of Sunday, the top UN office has recorded 18,358 civilian casualties in the country, out of which 7,031 people have been killed and 11,327 injured. In Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the UN authorities have recorded 9,853 casualties, 4,102 killed and 5,751 injured. Dnipro was in mourning today after the Russian attack alleged to have killed 40 civilians and left 75 wounded, including 14 children. Russia claimed it was not to blame for the destruction in Dnipro as it was caused by Ukrainian air defenses. Kyiv says the apartment building was hit by a Russian ship-to-ship missile, a type that Ukraine does not have the capability to shoot down. The death toll from a Russian missile strike in city of Dnipro rose to 40 today, with dozens more missing, making it the deadliest civilian incident of Moscow's 3-month campaign of firing missiles at cities far from the front line. Ukraine's infrastructure could collapse at any second as Russia's sporadic missile attacks along with freezing winter temperatures put local authorities under increasing strain, Kyiv's mayor has warned. Vitaly Klitschko and his brother Vladimir told Reuters that Ukraine's Western allies had to speed up deliveries of air defense systems capable of downing Russian missiles. Belarus's exiled opposition leader has said she does not think Russia will launch an offensive on Ukraine from her country after the two nations began military drills, but warned Moscow could launch more missile strikes from its allies' territory. Moscow and Minsk started joint military exercises on Monday, triggering fears in Kyiv and the West that Moscow could use its ally to launch a new ground offensive in Ukraine. Russia has produced the first set of Poseidon nuclear-capable super torpedoes that are being developed for deployment on the Belgorod nuclear submarine. US and Russian officials have both described Poseidon as a new category of retaliatory weapon, capable of triggering radioactive ocean swells to render coastal cities uninhabitable. More than 7,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine since Russia invaded its neighbor last February, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, said on Monday. The UN Rights Office said it had confirmed 7,031 civilian deaths but believes actual casualty tolls are considerably higher given the pending corroboration of many reports and the inaccessibility of areas where intense fighting is taking place. Most of the recorded civilian deaths occurred in government-held areas of Ukraine, 6,536 compared with 495 recorded in Russian-held areas. OHCHR did not attribute responsibility for the deaths. Ukraine says the numbers of civilians killed could run into the tens of thousands. Both countries deny targeting civilians. 2 days after a Russian missile attack destroyed a section of an apartment building in Dnipro, the death toll of the strike rose to 40 people, including 3 children, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast Military Administration reported on January 16. At least 76 people were injured, the administration said, and 26 people are still missing as of the late evening on January 16. First responders continue to work at the site. Dnipropetrovsk Oblast Governor Valentin Reznichenko reported earlier in the day that 14 children were among the injured. A Russian missile hit the apartment block in a residential neighborhood in Dnipro, a city of 1 million people in central Ukraine, in the early afternoon of January 14, making it one of the deadliest single attacks on civilian areas up to date since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. In total, Russia's war has killed at least 7,031 civilians in Ukraine since February 24, the United Nations Human Rights Agency reported on January 16, adding that at least 11,327 people were injured. Most of the civilian casualties recorded were caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including shelling from heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes. The agency noted that the actual numbers may be significantly higher as data from areas experiencing intense hostilities or those under Russian occupation, such as Mariupol in the eastern Donetsk Oblast or Severodonetsk in neighboring Luhansk Oblast, has been delayed, and numerous reports require further verification. Although Russia has failed most of its major objectives in the war, including capturing Kyiv in the early days of the full-scale invasion and the entirety of the eastern Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, Russian President Vladimir Putin hasn't changed his maximalist objectives to seize all of Ukraine, the Institute for the Study of War said in its latest update. The US-based think tank said that Moscow was likely aiming to conduct a decisive action in the next 6 months to regain the upper hand in Ukraine after a series of failures and successful Ukrainian counteroffensives. The ISW suggests that the major offensive will most likely happen in the area of Luhansk Oblast, most of which is currently occupied. Meanwhile, the most dangerous course of action, offensive against northern Ukraine, remains unlikely at this time, the think tank said. Concerns about Russia attacking northern Ukraine from Belarus renewed amid the joint military exercises that the Russian and Belarusian air forces started on January 16. Russia also reportedly sent 40 railroad cars with military personnel and equipment to Belarus last week. Minsk has participated in Moscow's aggression by allowing Russia to use its territory for attacks against Ukraine. However, Belarusian troops have not been involved in invading Ukraine yet. The Ukrainian military also expects Russia to conduct a new major offensive in the east of Ukraine. General Staff Deputy Chief Alexei Hromov said on January 12 Moscow would likely try to reach the administrative borders of Donetsk Oblast, about half of which is currently occupied, in the near future. Amid the threat of a new major Russian offensive, Ukraine's Western allies pledged additional military aid. On January 16, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace announced the country would hand over to Kyiv 14 Challenger 2 tanks to help push back the Russian invasion. The tanks will be supplied with armored recovery and repair vehicles. Equipped with advanced targeting technology and armor, the Challenger 2 tank is considered to be superior to the Soviet-era tanks operated by Russian and Ukrainian forces. Wallace also said the UK will deliver a battery of 8 AS-90 self-propelled 155mm howitzers and 2 further batteries at varying states of readiness. In addition, the UK will donate hundreds of armored and protective vehicles, including Bulldog personnel carriers, more uncrewed aerial systems to support Ukrainian artillery, some 100,000 artillery rounds, hundreds of missiles, including guided multiple launch rocket system, GMLRS, Starstreak air defense, medium-range air defense missiles. Britain will start training Ukrainian soldiers to use the Challenger 2 tanks and guns in the coming days. Ukraine's allies must accelerate our collective efforts to dramatically, economically, and militarily keep the pressure on Putin, Wallace said. Britain's move could also heap pressure on Germany to authorize the delivery of modern German-built Leopard 2 tanks during the Ramstein Defense Summit on January 20. Polish President Andrzej Duda said on January 11 that Poland planned to supply a company of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. But since the vehicles are produced in Germany, their supply has to be approved by Berlin. Also on January 16, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki urged the German government to provide Ukraine with all types of weapons. Bloomberg reported on January 13, citing 2 unnamed officials familiar with the matter, that Germany will likely make a decision on whether to supply Leopard tanks to Ukraine next week, ahead of the Ramstein summit. Russia is warning Monday that the Challenger 2 tanks the United Kingdom has pledged to send over to Ukraine in their battle against Vladimir Putin's military will burn just like the rest. Vladimir Solovyev, a Russian state TV host, also said Sunday that, "I consider Britain is now a legitimate target for us as it continues to supply weaponry to Ukraine," Reuters reports. Challenger 2 main battle tanks are displayed for the families watching the Royal Tank Regiment Regimental Parade on September 24, 2022 in Bulford, England. On Saturday, the office of UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said UK defence and security officials believe a window has opened up where Russia is on the back foot due to resupply issues and plummeting morale. Sending Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine is the start of a gear change in the UK's support, a statement read. A squadron of 14 tanks will go into the country in the coming weeks after the Prime Minister told President Zelensky that the UK would provide additional support to aid Ukraine's land war. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov attends an annual end-of-year news conference of Russian President Vladimir Putin, in Moscow, Russia, on December 23, 2021. The war has once again been ramping up, and both Russia and Ukraine look to bolster their forces and take control over the battlefield in the Donbass, where intense fighting continues along a 50-mile axis. Zelensky has long urged Western allies to send his troops on the East Front tanks. Partner nations like France and Poland have begun to answer the calls. Earlier this month, Paris pledged to send AMX-10 RC light tanks, and Warsaw this week said it would send its German-made Leopard tanks to the war-torn nation. Russia is stepping up its use of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems to conduct strikes on ground targets, suggesting that Moscow's stocks of ballistic missiles are running low, Ukraine's Air Force spokesman said on Monday. The official, Yuri Anat, cited Ukrainian intelligence as claiming that Russia had fewer than 100 modern Iskander ballistic munitions left. He said Russia was, instead, using its S-300 and S-400 systems because of an abundance of munitions. Britain's Ministry of Defense said last month that Russia had likely expended a large portion of its stocks of SS-26 Iskander short-range ballistic missiles, which can carry a 500 kg warhead up to 500 km, 310 miles. Russia's Ministry of Defense has not commented on the claims, which could not be independently verified. Dwindling stocks of weaponry could become key issues for both sides in a war that has raged for almost 11 months and appears set to continue. The S-300 system belongs to a family of surface-to-air missiles that were originally developed by the Soviet Union. It was first put into operation in the late 1970s after a decade of development. They are used by both Ukraine and Russia, although the latter has far more systems in its inventory. Moscow developed the S-400 system to replace the aging S-300 system in 2007. Anat said Russian forces preferred to use the more plentiful S-300s against ground targets, although S-400s were also being utilized in this way. He said the S-300s can be used against ground targets up to 150 kilometers away and presented a threat to Ukraine. According to Cherevity, Soledar remains contested, while Ukrainian troops are focused on two objectives in the area. He added that the armed forces of Ukraine successfully managed to carry out these two tasks in Donbass for months, decimating the opposing force on an industrial scale and preventing them from advancing strategically. Our units are fighting and inflicting constant losses on the enemy, the spokesman added. Russian military command appears to have become obsessed with seizing Soledar in the first weeks of 2023. Earlier, Ukraine's Operational Command East spokesman Serhiy Cherevity reported that Russia has deployed the bulk of its forces, including Wagner mercenaries, near Soledar in Donetsk Oblast. By January 13, Russian media were already claiming victory in the battle for Soledar, while Ukraine's general staff maintains that fighting for the town continues. Conquering Soledar would enable Moscow's forces to put increased pressure on nearby Bakhmut.